The Georgia sky was not merely gray. Inside the car, the air smelled of stale upholstery and old anxieties. Margaret Holloway, 57 years of age, studied her reflection in the rearview mirror. It was a face the business world knew well, sharp, calculated, and unyielding. But today, she was a ghost. With deliberate, slow movements, she reached up and began to dismantle the image of a CEO. She tore through her salon-styled hair with her fingers, tossing the neat waves into a frantic, messy nest. The $700 charcoal blazer, the armor of her empire, was stripped off and tossed into the back seat like common refuse. In its place, she donned a gray, oversized zip-up hoodie, purchased for $3 from a thrift store bin. It was thin. It was faded. It was invisible. She paused, her hand trembling slightly as she pulled the sleeve up her left wrist. There, etched into her skin like a permanent map of her past, was the scar, a jagged, pale mark from a boiling oil spill 30 years ago, when she was nothing more than a girl with a tray and a desperate hunger for a better life. That scar was her anchor. "Don't forget," she whispered to the foggy glass. "Don't forget the smell of the grease, or the way the bus bench feels against your spine when you have nowhere else to sleep." She wasn't at this particular Clayton's location to audit the spreadsheets. She was there to find the heartbeat of her company, or to confirm that it had finally stopped beating. Margaret stepped out into the rain. The cold soaked through her thin hoodie instantly, a reminder of what it felt like to be unprotected. She walked into the restaurant, the bell chiming a lonely, tinny note. The air inside was thick with the scent of fried onions and floor wax. And then she saw her. The girl, her name tag read Caleb, was a vision of controlled exhaustion. She moved with a grace that felt like a quiet, desperate art form. Her deep, ebony skin shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights, but it was her eyes, those heavy, shadowed eyes, that told the story of 1,000 sleepless nights. Margaret sat in a corner booth, tucked away in the shadows. She watched. Caleb was a marvel of instinct. A glass began to tip at a nearby table. Before it could even shatter, Caleb's hand shot out, catching it midair without spilling a drop. An elderly man, red-faced and snapping his fingers, began to berate her about the temperature of his soup. Caleb didn't flinch. She leaned in, her voice a calm, melodic hum, soothing the man's jagged edges until he lowered his head in ashamed silence. But there was a fracture in the performance. Margaret noticed it every time Caleb passed the heavy steel door of the dry storage room. The girl would hitch, a tiny, almost imperceptible break in her stride. Her fingers would tighten around the silver tray until her knuckles turned a ghostly white. Her lips moved, not in speech, but in a silent, frantic prayer. Margaret watched those dark, slender hands. They were trembling, not from the weight of the 7 plates she carried, but from the crushing gravity of a secret that lived behind that steel door. The restaurant was a stage, and Caleb was performing for her life. But Margaret could see the seams coming apart. She could smell the fear, a scent more pungent than the rain-soaked carpets. Something was dying in this building. And it wasn't just the service. Margaret ordered a black coffee, her eyes never leaving the girl. She felt the old sting of her own scar, pulsing in rhythm with the girl's frantic heart. "What are you hiding, Caleb?" Margaret breathed into the steam of her cup. "And who is making you so afraid to speak?" The answer came, not in the whisper, but in the heavy, thudding footsteps of a man who believed the world was his to bruise. The air in the room shifted, turning cold and sharp. The predator had entered the room. The atmosphere didn't just change, it curdled. Raymond Denard didn't enter a room, he invaded it. It was a man of soft edges and a hard heart, his belt straining against a stomach that spoke of unearned excess. He wore his manager's shirt like a general's uniform, though the fabric was cheap, and the man inside it was smaller than the shadow he tried to cast. He stood in the center of the dining room, legs braced wide, a king of a kingdom made of formica and grease. He didn't look at the customers as guests. He looked at them as witnesses to his play for power. Caleb. The name exploded in the quiet room like a gunshot. Margaret felt the girl flinch, a physical jolt that traveled from her heels to her shoulders. Caleb was currently balancing a heavy tray, delivering bowls of steaming harvest soup to a family of 4. At the sound of that voice, her hands betrayed her. Dunard didn't wait for her to turn. He marched forward, his face twisted into a mask of theatrical irritation. As he drew near, he didn't stop his momentum. His heavy arm accidentally swept across the air, catching the edge of the tray. The world seemed to slow down. The bowls tilted, the ceramic groaned, and then the liquid fire of the soup cascaded over the edge, splashing directly onto Caleb's bare, dark forearms. The girl didn't scream. She let out a sharp, hissed breath, the sound of air leaving a wounded lung. She dropped to her knees, not out of submission, but to keep the remaining glass from shattering on the floor. "Look at this," Dinar sneered, his voice loud enough to ensure every fork in the restaurant stopped moving. "Look at this clumsy, pathetic display. Do I pay you to feed the carpet, Caleb? Or are you just too dim-witted to understand the basic physics of a tray?" Caleb's breath was coming in ragged gasps. The soup was scalding, reddening the skin of her arms, but she didn't reach for a napkin. She couldn't. I'm sorry, Mr. Dinar," she whispered, her head bowed so low her forehead almost touched the floor. "It won't happen again. Please. I'll clean it." "You're damn right you'll clean it," Dinar hissed. Caleb reached for a cloth at her belt, but Dinar's foot shod in a polished, ugly loafer stepped firmly on the rag. "No," he said, his voice dropping to a toxic, intimate purr. "That's for professionals. You need something more suited to your level of competence." He reached onto a nearby table, grabbed a stack of thin, flimsy paper napkins, and threw them into the puddle of soup at her feet. "Get down there. On your knees. Wipe it up. Every drop. And don't you dare get up until I can see my reflection in that tile." Margaret Holloway's knuckles turned white as she gripped her coffee mug. She felt a heat in her chest that had nothing to do with the beverage. It was the cold, crystalline rage of a woman who had seen many bullies, but none so small as this. Caleb began to dab at the mess with the useless scraps of paper. They disintegrated instantly, turning into a gray, mushy pulp in her hands. Dinar leaned over her, casting a long, dark shadow over her trembling frame. "What's the matter?" he mocked. "Did you think that skin of yours made you invisible? Did you think you could just slip away for 10 minutes every hour and I wouldn't notice? You think you're smart, don't you? Playing hide-and-seek on my time." Caleb's hands stopped moving. The mention of her hiding sent a fresh wave of terror through her. I had to check. Just for a second." "Shut up," Dinar barked. "I don't want excuses from an urban parasite. You look like a beggar. You act like a beggar. And today, you're going to crawl like one." He turned to the room, gesturing to the girl on the floor, as if she were a museum exhibit of failure. "Apologize to them," he commanded. "Go to every table, every single one. You tell them that because of your ignorance and your sluggishness, their dinner is delayed. Go on. Move!" Caleb stood up, her legs shaking so violently she had to lean against a chair. Her eyes were swimming in tears that she refused to let fall. She was a girl being stripped of her dignity in a public square, and the man holding the whip was smiling. Margaret watched as Caleb approached the first table, her voice a broken thread. "I am so sorry for my stupidity. Please forgive me." Dinar stood behind her, arms crossed, nodding in approval. He wasn't managing a restaurant. He was breaking a human spirit, and he was enjoying the sound of the snap. The air in the room felt thin, as if Raymond Dinar's ego was consuming all the oxygen. He watched Caleb stumble from table to table, her soul being ground into the floorboards with every forced apology. But for Dinar, humiliation was merely the appetizer. He wanted the kill. He leaned in close to her, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and malice. "You think I don't know, don't you?" he whispered. But the whisper had a jagged edge that carried across the silent room. "You think I'm as blind as you are pathetic? You've been hiding a package in my storeroom." Caleb froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin a haunted, ashen gray. "Mr. Dinar, please," she gasped, her voice a fragile sliver of glass. He's very sick. I didn't have anyone. The sitter canceled. I couldn't believe him. A sick brat." Dinar laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "In my inventory. What did you think this was, girl? A refugee camp? A ward for the diseased? Please. Caleb's voice broke, a raw sob finally escaping. She lunged toward him, not to attack but to plead. Danny is only 7. He has a fever of 102. I just needed him where I could see him, where I could know he was breathing. Please don't do this here. Her internal scream was deafening. Don't take the last thing I have. Don't take my dignity in front of the world I'm trying to survive in. Dinar didn't just ignore her. He thrived on the desperation. He turned away from her and marched toward the heavy steel door of the dry storage. He kicked it open with a violent thud that echoed like a casket closing. A moment later, he emerged, dragging a small shivering bundle by the hood of an oversized sweatshirt. It was Danny. The boy's face was a terrifying shade of crimson, his eyes glazed and unfocused from the heat of the fever. He looked like a small broken bird, his limbs tucked in, shaking so hard his teeth rattled. Dunar held the boy up in the center of the dining room, parading him like a piece of spoiled meat. Look at this, he bellowed to the horrified patrons. This is why your coffee is cold. This is why your floors are dirty. Because this girl thinks my payroll is a welfare check. She's turned your dining experience into a nursery for the sick. Caleb reached for her brother, but Dunar shoved her back with a meaty hand. Look at him, Dinar sneered, pointing at the boy's flushed face. Is this what we've come to, bringing the plague into a place of business? You're not just incompetent, Caleb. You're a public health hazard. He marched toward the front entrance, the rain still screaming against the glass. He threw the door wide, letting the freezing wet gale whip into the warm restaurant. Out, Dunar commanded, his finger pointing into the darkness of the storm. You, the brat, all of it. Get your color out of my sight. If I see your face within a mile of this property in 5 minutes, I'm calling the police. I'll have you charged with child endangerment and trespassing. Caleb threw herself onto the wet floor, sliding toward her brother. She scooped Danny into her arms, pulling his burning body against her rain-chilled chest. She didn't look at the customers. She didn't look at Dunar. She simply curled around the child, a shield of bone and grief. I'm sorry, Danny, she wailed, the sound high and piercing, lost under the roar of the rain and the low, cruel chuckle of the man standing over them. I'm so sorry. Dunar stood there, a silhouette of absolute tyranny, watching a sister and her dying hope crawl out into the freezing night. The door slammed shut behind Caleb, muffled by the roar of the downpour. For a heartbeat, the restaurant was silent, save for the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the soup still sliding off the tables. Raymond Denard turned back to the room, dusting his hands together, as if he had just cleared away a pile of roadside trash. He flashed a sickening, greasy smile at the patrons. Now then, he chirped, his voice dripping with false professional courtesy. Who's ready for dessert? In the corner, the shadow moved. Margaret Holloway stood up. She didn't move quickly, but the weight of her presence seemed to pull the very air toward her. She stepped out from the dim light of the booth, her soaked thrift store hoodie clinging to her frame like a sodden shroud. She walked toward the counter, her footsteps heavy and deliberate, clicking against the tile with the precision of a ticking clock. Dinar saw her coming. He saw the homeless woman he had ignored all evening. He rolled his eyes, his lip curling in a fresh wave of disgust. The show's over, lady, he snapped, waving a hand dismissively. We don't give out freebies. Take your coffee and get out before I lose my patience twice in one night. Margaret didn't stop. She reached the counter and stood directly in front of him. Up close, she was shorter than him, but she seemed to look down on him from a great icy height. Without a word, she reached into the pocket of her faded jacket. She didn't pull out a wallet. She pulled out a small, slim case made of hand-stitched, midnight blue leather. She flipped it open and slid a single card onto the counter. It wasn't a credit card. It was a heavy, cream-colored business card with a gold-embossed seal that Dunar recognized with a jolt that seemed to stop his heart. Raymond Dunar, Margaret said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the cutting edge of a guillotine. Manager at Clayton's for 8 years. Transferred through 3 different locations in 5 years due to rigid management styles. 14 staff members have resigned under your watch in the last 7 months alone. Donar's face went from a sallow yellow to a ghostly, translucent white. He looked at the card. He looked at the woman. He looked at the scar on her wrist. Who the hell are you? He stammered, his bravado evaporating like mist in a furnace. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea locking onto his. I am not your customer, Raymond, she whispered, her voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal power. I am the woman who pays for that polo shirt currently strangling your neck. I am the woman who pays for the chair you sit in while you plot your little cruelties. And from this exact second, I am the person who is ending your miserable, pathetic existence in this corporation. She paused, letting the silence hang until it felt like a physical weight on his chest. I am Margaret Holloway, and you are fired. Right now. No severance. No notice. No second chances. Dinar's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You can't. I have a contract. I was just maintaining standards. That girl was a liability. The only liability in this room, Margaret cut him off, is a man who has forgotten that he is human. My protocol, Raymond, has always been very simple. I never leave the garbage in my kitchen for too long. She turned her head slightly toward the back of the room. Security. Two men in suits who had been sitting at a discreet table near the kitchen stood up instantly. They had been waiting for the signal. Escort Mr. Dinar out, Margaret commanded, never taking her eyes off the trembling man. He is not to touch his office. He is not to speak to the staff. If he sets foot on Holloway property again, have him arrested for the very things he threatened that girl with. Get him out of my sight. The air in here is already starting to clear. The bailiff of Clayton's was led away, his frantic protests dying out as he was shoved into the same rain that had swallowed Caleb minutes before. Margaret looked at the remaining staff, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. She didn't offer a smile. She didn't have one left. She turned and ran back out into the storm. The rain was no longer just water. It was a wall of ice that blurred the world into a jagged, gray smear. Margaret ran. Her lungs burned with the cold air, and her boots splashed through deep, oil-slicked puddles. She didn't look for a taxi. She didn't look for her car. She looked for a shadow, a small, huddled shape that the world had tried to erase. She found them at a bus stop 3 blocks away. It was a skeletal structure of glass and rusted metal, offering no real protection from the wind. Caleb was sitting on the freezing bench, her body bent in a protective arc over Danny. She had stripped off her own thin uniform shirt, leaving herself in only a camisole, to wrap the extra layer around the boy. Danny was shivering so violently that the bench itself seemed to vibrate. His breath was coming in short, wet rattles. As Margaret approached, Caleb didn't look up with hope. She looked up with a hollow, defensive stare of a hunted animal. She pulled Danny tighter, her knuckles bruised and dark against his pale skin. "Please," Caleb rasped, her voice nearly gone. "I'm leaving. We're waiting for the late bus. I won't go back there. I promise. Just let us stay until the bus comes." Margaret stopped. The CEO, the titan of industry, the woman who had fired a man with a single sentence, felt herself crumple. She looked at this 18-year-old girl, standing on the edge of an abyss, and saw the ghost of her own past the girl, with the scarred wrist and the empty stomach. "I'm not here to move you, Caleb," Margaret said, her voice breaking. She stepped closer and knelt on the wet concrete in front of the girl. She reached out, but Caleb flinched. "I don't want money," Caleb whispered, her eyes filling with a sudden, fierce pride that cut Margaret deeper than any insult. I worked today. I worked 8 hours. Can I just have the pay for today? I need to buy the fever reducers. I need the medicine for Danny. That's all. I don't want anything else." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 1,000 failures. Margaret realized in that moment that her empire was built on the backs of people she had never bothered to see. She had built a machine that turned human souls into quarterly dividends. "You'll have your pay, Caleb," Margaret said, her voice a low, shaking vow. "And you'll have so much more." She took off her heavy, waterlogged hoodie and wrapped it around both of them, her hands touching Caleb's freezing shoulders. "I'm Margaret. I own the company. And I am so deeply sorry that I let a monster guard my house." Through a series of frantic phone calls, Margaret's private car arrived. As they lifted the semi-conscious Danny into the leather interior, Margaret began to learn the truth. Caleb wasn't just a struggling worker. She was a survivor of a car accident that had claimed both her parents 2 years prior. She was a girl who had turned down foster care for herself to fight a legal battle to keep her brother. She was a girl who worked 3 jobs, slept 4 hours, and studied for her GED in the flickering light of a storage room, all to keep a 7-year-old from the cold indifference of the state. Margaret looked out the window at the glowing sign of another Clayton's in the distance. The golden logo seemed to mock her. Did I build a sanctuary? She asked herself. Or did I build a prison for the kindest souls I have? The vessel of success she had spent 30 years polishing felt suddenly like a hollow copper shell. She had won the world, but she had let the spirit of her own company rot from the top down. The verdict was in, and it was Margaret Holloway who was truly on trial. 15 months had passed since the night the sky fell in Georgia. The air at Clayton's was different now. It didn't smell of fear or stale grease. It smelled of fresh rosemary, toasted sourdough, and something far rarer, dignity. Margaret Holloway stood at the edge of the dining room, no longer in a thrift store hoodie, but in a soft, cream-colored silk blouse. She wasn't hiding. She was breathing. She watched the front door swing open, and her heart did a slow, steady skip of pride. Caleb walked in. She wasn't the trembling ghost from the rain anymore. She wore a tailored charcoal vest, her deep dark skin glowing with a health that came from peace, her natural curls gathered into a neat, elegant crown. She moved through the restaurant, not like an artist in a trance, but like a captain on her ship. She stopped by a new trainee, a young man who looked nervous, and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "The system is just a tool," Caleb said, her voice warm and resonant. "The person sitting in that chair. That's the mission. If they're hurting, we fix it. If they're hungry, we feed them. Everything else is just math." Margaret felt a tear prick her eye. She had done more than just fire a bully. She had dismantled the machine and rebuilt a home. Following that terrible night, Margaret hadn't just given Caleb a check. She had placed a bet. A bet on the resilience of a girl who had survived the storm. She had paid for the medical bills that saved Danji's lungs. And then she had paid for the tuition that unlocked Caleb's mind. But Margaret hadn't stopped there. She had looked into the hollow eyes of her own corporation and realized she was the one who had let the light go out. She established the Eleanor Marsh Foundation, named after the mother Caleb had lost. It was a safety net, a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated to the invisible workers. It provided emergency childcare, scholarships for guardians, and a direct line to the CEO's office for any employee who felt the shadow of a Raymond dinar looming over them. "The garbage is gone, Margaret," Caleb said, stepping up beside her. She didn't call her ma'am. She called her by her name. "A peer. A friend. A friend." "It is," Margaret whispered, "and the garden is finally growing." A small blur of motion erupted from the corner booth. Danny, now 8 years old, his face full and bright, raced toward them. He wasn't shivering. He was laughing. He caught Caleb around the waist, his eyes shining with the simple, beautiful joy of a child who no longer had to hide in the dark. "Are we going to the park now, Cal?" the boy asked, his voice clear and strong. Caleb looked at Margaret. "I think the park sounds perfect." As they walked out into the brilliant Georgia sunshine, the light caught the pale, jagged scar on Margaret's wrist and the proud, radiant skin of Caleb's face. They were both survivors. Margaret watched them go, 2 souls she had almost let drown in the rain. She realized then that success wasn't measured in the number of restaurants she owned, but in the number of people who could stand upright within them. Kindness, she understood now, was not a gift you gave to the weak. It was a choice you made to be strong. The old scar on her wrist no longer felt like a reminder of pain. It felt like a badge of honor, a vessel of grace that had led her back to her own humanity. The storm was over, and for the first time in 30 years, Margaret Holloway felt truly warm. Warm